how do you make bread? How do you take flour and yeast and turn it into this? Something that you could put in your mouth and eat. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to learn how to make bread from scratch at home. And to be more specific, I'm going to be showing you how to make a crescent-shaped dinner roll. We're going to be talking about yeast. We're going to be talking about proofing bread dough and shaping bread dough. If this is your first time, if you've never made bread before, I know it could be a little intimidating because a lot of people tend to think that making bread has a lot of strict rules. I'm here to tell you that it really doesn't. I'm gonna be walking you through the process step by step. The goal of this video is to clear all your confusion about bread making, and I want you to feel comfortable and confident about it. Hopefully at the end of this video you would have a better understanding of how the bread making process is, because it doesn't matter what method you're using and it doesn't matter what type of bread you're making. They all go through the same process, and once you get the basic idea down, you could then move on to making any bread you want. The possibility is endless. Before we jump into it, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And let's make some bread. Before we even get into making the bread dough, we gotta talk about yeast. Yeast is essential to bread making. It is a living organism that makes the bread rise. The most common types of yeast you're gonna find at the stores are active, dried, and instant, sometimes called rabbit rice. There's also fresh yeast, which is what the professional bakers like to use. Now you might be asking, which one should I use, and what if the recipe calls for instant and I only have active dry? Well, to tell you the truth, there really isn't a big difference between the two in terms of flavor. You can replace one with another. The biggest difference will be the time it takes to proof the bread. Instant yeast is going to take less than active dry. So if a recipe calls for instant and you only have active dry, go ahead and use it, but just add about 25% more of what the recipe calls for to replace the instant yeast. No need to make an extra trip to the store. Use whatever you have. I personally like using instant yeast because the granules are a lot smaller compared to active dry, as you can see here in this picture. And you could add it directly to the dries, although for active dry yeast you could add it directly to the flour as well, but since active dry has larger granules, I'd really recommend dissolving it in liquid first before using. And it's a misconception that active dry yeast needs to be bloomed or activated by mixing with some water and sugar and wait 10 minutes until it's foamy. I mean, it's a good way to check if the yeast is still alive, but unless you bought your yeast in the 80s, which by the way, you should really throw that out and get new ones, it really isn't necessary. Oh, and store your yeast in the fridge. It will last for a long time. Alright, now that we got the confusion about yeast out of the way, the first step to making bread is to go over the ingredients list. Because trust me, you don't want to be making it halfway and then realize that you're missing something. Next is to get everything measured out and ready to go. It is a good way to stay on top of your baking game and keep everything organized. And speaking of measuring ingredients, look, here's the thing. A lot of people, a lot of YouTubers, a lot of recipe developers are going to tell you that you need to have a digital scale. I'm here to tell you that's not entirely true. If you're like really committed, if you want to be more advanced in baking, then yeah, sure, go ahead and buy a digital scale. But if you're brand new to this, I'd say it's fine if you don't have a digital scale, because let's be honest, people's been baking without a scale for like thousands of years and they're totally fine. Their bread still came out delicious. So I'm here to tell you that it's okay to use measuring cups, but there is a correct way of using this. I'm going to show you how. To measure flour correctly, first fluff up the flour so it's not compact, scoop it, and level it off with a knife. Here's another way to do it. You could sprinkle the flour into the measuring cup and level it off, just like what we did before. That's how you measure flour, using a measuring cup. Let's talk about flour real quick. When you're new to baking bread, there are really only two types of flour you should be using. And number one is all-purpose flour, and number two is bread flour. So when do you use all-purpose flour and when do you use bread flour? Well, say you're making cinnamon rolls or donuts, anything that's kind of soft and fluffy, then you would want to go for all-purpose flour. If you're making like a sandwich bread that's a little chewier, then you would definitely want to go for bread flour. But what if you want to have two kinds of texture? You want it to be fluffy and soft, but you also want it to be chewy. That's when you could use two kinds of flour. You can mix all-purpose and bread flour to get to the texture that you want. And this is something that you could definitely play with. And if you're completely new to this, I'd say stay away from other types of flour like rye or whole wheat. Get familiar with bread flour and all-purpose flour first, and then you can move on to playing with other types of flour. Step 2, we're going to start mixing and kneading the dough. In a large bowl, pour in a mixture of half a cup of milk and half a cup of water. The temperature of the liquid is pretty cold because I had just taken the milk out of the fridge. It is a hot day, so I didn't bother warming up the liquid. If where you are temperature is low, you might want to warm up the liquid to about 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit to speed up the proofing process. But just be sure the liquid is not boiling hot, otherwise it will kill the yeast. To that, add 3 tablespoons of melted butter, 4 tablespoons of sugar, 1.5 teaspoons of instant yeast, and 1 teaspoon of salt. Whisk everything up with a fork, then dump in 2 cups of bread flour and half a cup of all-purpose flour. Combine everything with a spatula and the dough is going to look very shaggy at first, but just keep going. It's okay if there's some dry flour on the bottom. When the dough is all in one piece, you could just stop right there and cover it with a towel and let it rest for 15 minutes. This will allow the flour to absorb moisture and hydrate, which will make it a lot easier for the next step, which is kneading the dough. 15 minutes later, the dough will look something like this. And when you touch it, you can feel that it's not as dry as before and it should be pretty soft. So I often get this question a lot, which is how come I follow the recipe exactly to a T, but my dough is just so wet to a point that there's no way for me to work with it? Well, here's my answer to that. Weather, humidity, brand of flour you're using, each brand of flour is going to behave a little differently, and also different season when you're making dough in summertime versus during winter time. It's all gonna come out a little differently. So you might be asking, well then what the hell am I supposed to do? Here's my solution to that. If your bread dough is like super wet, then it's totally fine to add a tiny bit of flour. 1 tablespoon of flour at a time and just kind of work it out. And once it gets to the correct consistency, then you're good to go. Some recipes, the dough is just going to be a lot wetter than the other ones. So if you feel like your dough is a little too wet, just simply add a tiny bit of flour, but don't go crazy on that, because once you add too much flour and your dough is like super dry, it's really hard for that dough to absorb more liquid. So just remember, it's better that your dough is wet than it being dry. Remove the dough from the bowl and transfer it onto a smooth work surface. Ooh, check this out. I just want to show you this real quick. This is what the dough looks like before we knead it. There's not that much gluten to hold the dough together, so when I tear it, it just falls apart very easily. In order for the bread to rise and have a soft and fluffy texture, you really want to make sure the gluten structure is strong so it could trap air inside. And you could achieve that by kneading the dough. You see, when yeast is activated, they start eating the sugar that's in the dough and they digest it and poop out gas. Yes, bread is basically yeast farts because it's full of air. And when flour is mixed with water, the two proteins that are in the flour form and turn into a network of gluten. And that network of gluten, they have the ability to trap the gas that's pooped out by the yeast, making the bread rise. But in order to achieve superior texture, you really want that gluten network to be strong. Otherwise, you'll end up with a dense and sad loaf of bread. Everybody has their own way of handling the dough, and there's no specific way or a strict rule on how you should be kneading, but here's how I like to do it. I take the dough and I push it out with the heel of my hand, fold the dough onto itself and rotate it and repeat. I'm not using any flour on the work surface because I don't want to incorporate extra flour into the dough, which can make it dry, resulting in a dry and dense bread. I find kneading dough to be very therapeutic and relaxing because it is a good way to work out any issues or aggression you have. It's also a good way to exercise your arm and staying fit. Overall, it's just a very healthy activity, saves you money from going to therapy and the gym. You want to knead the dough until the gluten is well developed and the surface is smooth, which can take about 8 to 10 minutes. And to test if it's kneaded enough, you can take a piece of the dough and stretch it. If you can stretch it thin enough without it breaking right away and you can see light through it, it is a good indication that the dough is ready for the next step. Moving up to step 3, we're going to proof the dough. During this time, the dough will develop flavor and the gluten will have time to work on forming a tight network. It'll grow up to about double the original size, and just like any child that is still growing, you gotta discipline them and give them some love at the same time. This step is super straightforward. All you gotta do is cover it up and walk away and come back when it's puffed and double. I recommend taking a picture of the dough so you have a better idea of how much it's risen later on. A lot of recipes will tell you to proof it for a certain amount of time, like 45 minutes or 1 hour. The thing is, you really want to go by dough, not by time, because the amount of time it takes for bread dough to rise is going to be different for everyone. You see, there's a lot of factors that can affect bread dough, such as the temperature of the liquid you use or how much yeast is in there, as well as weather. Say where you live is super hot and humid like Louisiana, the dough is probably going to proof much faster because the yeast thrives in warm environment. So if you go by time and proof the dough for 1 hour according to the recipe, when in fact it only needed 45 minutes because your kitchen is like 90 degrees, it's most likely going to be overproofed. So don't go by time, go by dough, and I'll show you how to check if the dough is done proofing. On the other hand, if where you live is super cold and it's taking a long time for the dough to proof, you could put a blanket over it and cuddle with it so your body heat can warm it up. Or you could stick it in microwave or oven, both of those need to be off, and just put a glass of hot water in it to speed up the process. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information to take in all at once, but just remember this. Temperature is the key element that's going to determine how long it's going to take for your bread dough to proof. So since you can speed up the proofing process, you can actually slow it down too. And how do you do that? Well, you simply just stick your dough in the refrigerator. I have done that many times in my other videos. This is actually my preferred way of proofing the bread dough, which is sticking it in the fridge and letting it rise overnight. There's actually a couple benefits of doing so. And number one is that it gives you a longer window for you to work on the bread. So what I'm trying to say is it actually allows you to split the bread making process into 2 days, so you don't have to finish everything on the same day, which we all know that bread making can sometimes take a long time. Another benefit to this is that when you're cold proofing your dough, it actually allows the dough to develop more flavor. So your bread will have a more complex flavor. And I'm not saying that your bread is going to taste bad if you were to proof it in room temperature. No, your bread is still going to come out delicious. But what I'm trying to tell you is that there are benefits of proofing your dough in a colder environment, but ultimately, you do whatever that fits your schedule, and this is something that you can definitely play with. This is what my dough looks like after it's been proofing for about 1 hour and 15 minutes at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Besides checking the volume of the dough, you can also poke it to check if it's fully proofed. Poke the dough with your finger. If it springs back slowly and leaves an indentation that doesn't fill back up fully, it's good to go. I obviously went in too deep, now it looks like someone's belly button. We're now ready to shape the dough, which is step 4. Punch the dough down to release the air inside. Remember I said this was a good way to work out your aggression, and transfer it onto the work surface and divide it into 9 equal pieces. And take each piece of dough and flatten it slightly. Grab the edges and fold them to the center and pinch them together. It kind of looks like a bulb of garlic. Then flip it onto the work surface and use the palm of your hand. You kind of want your hand to look like this when you do it. It's almost like it's cupping something. And gently roll the dough on the surface in a circular motion. You can also do this with both of your hands instead of one hand. When you're rolling the dough, you're really creating tension on the surface so the gluten can tighten up and keep the dough in shape. After all the pieces of dough are rolled out into tiny balls, cover them with a towel and let them rest for about 15 minutes so the gluten can relax. And when we come back, we'll shape the balls into crescent shape. To shape it, roll each dough ball into a long teardrop shape, then flatten the top and roll the whole thing out with a rolling pin or beer bottle if you don't have a rolling pin. Take a piece of butter that's about 1/3 of a tablespoon, butter just makes everything taste better, right? And place it on the dough. Then fold the dough over the butter and seal it by pushing the edges down. And gently roll the dough down toward you and ta-da! You got a cute little dinner roll. Place all the shaped rolls on a sheet tray that's lined with parchment paper and they're now ready for step 5, the second proof. So the second proof is to reintroduce air back into the dough because we punched it out earlier, remember? And everything we've talked about during the first proof can be applied to the second proof, such as the temperature thing, but here's a bonus tip for you. So we've talked about how you could put your dough in the fridge to slow down the yeast activity. Well, did you know that you can stop the yeast activity altogether by putting your dough in the freezer? What you can do is you can make up a bunch of bread dough at a time. You could bake off some and you could freeze up the rest. I've done this in my cinnamon roll video, but I think a lot of people are confused about what to do after freezing the dough. So here's what you do. After you shape your dough, pop them in the freezer, and when you want freshly baked bread, all you gotta do is take them out of the freezer, place them on a baking sheet tray, thaw them out, and once they've come back to room temperature, they will continue proofing. So it doesn't matter which one you're using, it could be thawed out dough or fresh dough. Basically what you want to do is to leave them out at a warm place until they're puffed and doubled in size. And once again, if you took a picture of your dough, now you would have a reference to how much they've grown. You can also do the pokey pokey test like I've shown you earlier. We have finally arrived at the final step, baking the bread. Spread the dough with some water and sprinkle the top with some flaky salt. You can also do poppy seeds, everything seasoning, or even cheese, whatever you feel like. Pop them in a preheated 400 degrees Fahrenheit oven and bake them for about 15 to 20 minutes or until your house is filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and until they're golden brown and beautiful. That's how you make bread at home. Let's recap a little. So first you want to get all your ingredients measured out and ready to go, and then you're going to mix and knead your dough, and then you're going to proof your dough, and after that you're going to go ahead and shape them into whatever shape that you want them to be, and then you're going to proof them again, and then you could bake it, and boom, fresh bread straight out of your oven. So now that you have the basic knowledge of how the bread making process is like, you could go ahead and explore other bread recipes. You can make anything you want and the possibilities are endless. I hope you're feeling confident and comfortable about making your own bread now. And if there's anything that I left out, if there's anything I didn't get to explain, and if you have any question, please feel free to leave me a comment in the comment section. It's been really fun today. If you find today's video helpful, if you feel like you've learned something, definitely hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for hanging out today, and I'll see you back here next time.